Welcome to tonight's live stream. I'm going to get started in a minute. I just need to let everybody know that the live stream is getting started on other social media platforms. And what's going on, Turtle Sage? Glad to see you here. Tonight, we are going to be talking about Hollywood's creative slump. And Hollywood has been struggling for the last couple of years to create blockbusters at the box office and create the types of films that go on to become the classics that we had in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. And it looks like the Hollywood machine's ability to make those classic movies and those smash hit franchises people enjoyed over the last 3 decades has run out of gas. And the reason why Hollywood has run out of creative gas, as I personally see it as someone who has studied the entertainment industry for over 25 years, is that we are at the end of a creative cycle. And back the first creative cycle we had like this, it ran from the 1930s all the way to the 1960s. So anybody who knows about the history of Hollywood knows that we had a golden age of cinema from the 1930s all the way to the 1960s. And during that time, we had lots of great classic films come out during that era, like your Gone with the Winds, like your Martys, like your Sunset Boulevards, like your Ten Commandments. And this was a 30-year period of great creativity for Hollywood, where they created many classic genres like your musicals, your epic historical films, your war movies, and these were the blockbusters of that era. However, as Hollywood transitioned into the 1960s, we started to see box office start to decline. And the reason why we started to see box office in Hollywood start to decline as a result is most of the audience that grew up with these historical movies, these epic war movies, these musicals, most of that audience had grown old, and the new, younger baby boomer audience, they were coming of age, and the age they were coming into was a completely different era. I mean, kids who grew up in the mid to late 60s, the flower power era, the civil rights era, and the free love and free sex era, they weren't interested in seeing 3 hour war movies about World War II, a war they were not involved in. They were not interested in seeing people smiling and dancing in a musical when they were seeing people being attacked on the streets as they were protesting for their civil rights, and they were not interested in watching epic historical films with white faces, nor were they interested in watching movies that were of a completely different tone, especially in the case of these movies about World War II, when we had the Vietnam War going on. And because the audience that was growing up, the baby boomer audience, had a completely different set of tastes and a completely different world viewpoint, many of the movies that Hollywood was trying to produce at studios like MGM back in the 1960s, they were struggling to make money at the box office. And the only films that were making money at the time were smaller budgeted films like the Sergio Leone spaghetti westerns, films that were made by independent producers like Tom Laughlin, who made the classic 1967 film Born Losers. And Tom Laughlin's Born Losers was a game changer because this was the first independent film to create what people called the blockbuster. Now, you're Tom Laughlin. Most people in Hollywood had written him off, but Tom Laughlin knew what people wanted in films, and he tapped into the cultural pulse that was going on at the time because he knew that the Vietnam War was going on. You had a lot of frustrated baby boomers out there, and they had a different world viewpoint. And he tapped into that with the movie Born Losers, which was about a guy who came back from the Vietnam War, Billy Jack, who was a Green Beret. He came back to a country that had turned its back on him and did not support him, and he felt all alone. So he was really tapping into a lot of what people were feeling at the time with Born Losers, and it really tapped into the culture of disconnected police, disconnected law, lawlessness, and the biker gang was terrorizing the community, and he was like the only man who was willing to stand up for what was right. And this film resonated with people in 1967 who were upset about the state of the country, upset about the Vietnam War. And this was the game changer because this was the film that did not go through a Hollywood studio and went through an independent studio, went through his own personal production, which he financed himself, really. And then he took it to theaters, and that's how we got the whole concept of the blockbuster. The blockbuster was created by Tom Laughlin in 1967 with Born Losers. And after people saw Tom Laughlin make money with Born Losers and the Billy Jack character, that's when we started to see Melvin Van Peebles come in with Sweetback's song. And that film opened the door for black films and what they call the blaxploitation era. And D. Woodward makes a good point. You had Night of the Living Dead, which revived the whole horror genre, which was considered to be a B movie thing back in the from the 30s to the 60s. But thanks to this movie being a small budget film and doing well, this also opened the door for the horror genre. So all of them were small independent films, and this is what ushered in the new age for Hollywood, but Hollywood didn't really want to go along with that. It was kicking and screaming until it was forced to change because Hollywood wanted to continue going on making these musicals, World War II epics, and these epic historical films, but a lot of those movies were bombing at the box office and they were not really connecting with audiences. And your Hollywood executives, they did not like a lot of the movies that were connecting with audiences. For example, The Godfather, which was a film that is now considered a classic by baby boomers and Gen Xers and Gen Ys and millennials. This film was considered a cinematic classic. In the 1970s, early 1970s, Hollywood hated that movie, and they did not like that movie at all. However, the story of this Corleone family resonated with a lot of people back in the day who had these families that were struggling to stay together as a result of what was going on with the feminist movement, breaking up families, no fault divorce, breaking up families. And this film really resonated with people of that era, and it became a blockbuster, and it became a classic. And a lot of what happened in the 70s was you had studios who were forced to give a lot of new directors opportunities to create new characters, create new stories, and change the vision of Hollywood from the formal and what people consider to be stodgy acting approach, the formal cinematic approach, and we got a darker and grittier approach to filmmaking in the 1970s with these darker and grittier characters in films like Born Losers, in films like The Godfather, in films like Shaft. And this was the tone of the 1970s and the films that came about. You have these rough characters with rough edges, and it really reflected at the time because the country was in a period of change, and these characters really were relatable to viewers, and that's why box office started picking up because the films they were making were films that people could relate to in the 70s. But again, Hollywood was forced to do this because their backs were to the wall creatively, and they had to let new blood come in and bring their visions to the screen. And again, they were begrudgingly about it. A lot of times, these filmmakers had to go out here and beg to get the money to make their films. A lot of their films were made on small budgets. The studio executives didn't have a lot of faith in the projects they produced. And a lot of the filmmakers, they had to go out here and really scrap to make their films. And when they had to scrap to make their films, really made the quality of those films better because we started to see a lot of the passion of the filmmakers on screen. We started to see a lot of the passion of the actors on screen. And the stories that were presented, they had a lot of heart and soul in many of those 70s films. Now, as the 70s progressed into the late 70s, we got the phenomenon known as Star Wars. And when Star Wars was released in 1977, again, this was another film that people thought was going to be a major failure. The studio did not have much faith in Star Wars, but it went on to become a cultural phenomenon. And with the success of Star Wars, we started to see the evolution of what we had in the 1980s as related to what many people call the franchise movie. And because we had classics like Saturday Night Fever, which resonated with people about the struggles of young kids in the 70s. I always look at it as a parallel to 1950s Marty, and that Tony Manero is the son of Marty Paletti and his transformation arc about being a man. Then you had Rocky, which was another gritty film about a guy who wanted to get his break and wanted to show what he could do. And that resonated with people and went on to become a classic. And then you had Superman, the first superhero movie, come along. And that was the reason why they took a risk on Superman was because of the success of Star Wars. And Superman opened the door for what we have now as the superhero movie. So all of this opened the door for many of the genres we have. And we had Friday the 13th, which came along, which became the blockbuster as related to horror movies. Now, there were horror movies in the past, again, like your Night of the Living Dead, but Friday the 13th and Carrie, those were blockbusters, and Carrie was one of the horror movies that actually got Oscar nominations. So it was opening doors for new genres. And as we transitioned into the 80s, we started to see a lot, again, more creativity and studios wanting to take risks. And they were willing to take risks based on creativity and artistry because a lot of these films, when they would make them, they didn't cost a lot of money as related to budget. A lot of times, a lot of these directors and these special effects artists, they would make these films with extremely small budgets. And because they made these films with small budgets, they became big hits at the box office. And Hollywood could reap 200, 300, 400, even 100%, returns on their investments. Not 100%, 1000% returns on their investment in the US and far more money abroad. And they were making lots of money on these films because, again, the budgets were very small. They were using what they were calling no name actors at the time because in the 70s, Al Pacino was a no name actor, Christopher Reeve was a no name actor, Arnold Schwarzenegger was a no name actor. So they were getting these actors for extremely low salaries, and they were getting the directors who made their films for extremely low budgets. Now, as we transition into the 80s, we started to see the start of the sequel era. And the sequel era was where we started to see Empire Strikes Back, Superman 2, and Friday the 13th Part 2. And again, a continuation of those genres. And then we started to see the start of another genre, which was revived, the teen movie. Now, the teen movie had been around since the 50s, and it's been around for each generation. But with the John Hughes, we started to see a completely different narrative as related to teen movies because we had the early teen movie era of the 80s with a lot of jiggle movies and like Last American Virgin. But the ones that resonated with people were the John Hughes movies. And along with that, we got some other classic franchises and we got some great standalone movies like Lost Boys and many other movies like RoboCop. But again, you had a lot of creativity because the budgets were small. Now, where I started to see some problems with the whole movie thing as the start of the 90s, because that's when Hollywood was starting to depend on these sequels instead of being creative. What they were doing, I remember back in 1990, was they started to rely on these sequels. And what happened was they were expecting RoboCop 2 to do well, and they were expecting a whole host of other movies in 1990 to do well. Unfortunately, that was the first time they actually took a big hit because a lot of people weren't really interested in the sequels, and they also hired a lot of really grossly unqualified people to make the films. Like Frank Miller's screenplay was not strong on RoboCop 2, and that led to the film not performing well. And then the attempts to make a Dick Tracy franchise, it did not kick off because the film barely broke even. And the other movie, Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger, it underperformed, and that was the first hiccup for Hollywood was the early 90s. But they managed to regroup and still go back to making sequels because we had Terminator 2 Judgment Day, Batman Returns, and they did extremely well. And then the 90s, we started to see some creativity with movies like Clueless and many of the classic films of the 90s. And the decade went on strong. The 2000s, we saw some originality, and then we started to see the evolution of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And right now, the 2010s is where we're starting to see, the late 2010s is where we're starting to see Hollywood having problems. And this is where the cycle for Hollywood is starting all over again, because just like the late 60s and the early 70s, Hollywood right now is in a creative slump. And the reason why it's in a creative slump is because the audience has changed once again. And because the audience has changed once again, they're not interested in seeing the films that their fathers and their grandfathers used to watch. the same way people in the 60s, the baby boomer generation, were not interested in seeing the films that their fathers and grandfathers used to watch. And the big problem with Hollywood today is the same problem that Hollywood is having back in the 60s, was that you have a Hollywood that has become an echo chamber, and it's not about what you know from a creative standpoint these days, it's about who you know. And because it's about who you know, people who know each other greenlight their projects, and people who know each other greenlight projects that they like or have some sort of sentimental connection to. And this is why we get so many remakes being announced, so many reboots being announced, and so many films based on older properties, is because many of these Hollywood executives, just like the previous generation, they have an emotional attachment to the films of the past, the TV shows of the past, and they want to go out here and make the properties based on the things that they like, and they are not listening to the audience out here and listening to what the audience wants to see. They want to tell the audience what they should see, and that's the big problem they had back in the 60s and the 70s with, though, in the early days of MGM and the big studios, was they wanted to tell people what they should see, but they didn't want to listen to the audience or present what the audience had experienced and are experiencing right now. They don't want to talk to many of the millennials, the Gen Zs, the Gen Y people, and listen to them and create films that relate to their experiences in life or talk about their world and their struggles. And that's a big problem with Hollywood right now, because you have this echo chamber of rich executives, echo chamber of rich directors, echo chamber of older rich actors, and they're making films that are basically vanity projects, and they are not listening to the customers out here, and they're not understanding the issues that the customers are having out here. And this is why many of their films are struggling at the box office, because a lot of these people, they grew up with a lot of stuff that I used to watch in the 80s. I mean, I used to watch a lot of stuff like your Godzillas, which bombed at the box office. A lot of the other movies that have bombed at the box office. And those concepts, yes, they were fantastic in the 80s, which was a completely different world. But the world of our millennials, Gen Zs, Gen Ys is a completely different world. And they're not relating to these concepts that a lot of these studios want to produce. A lot of the concepts they want to produce out here, people look at that and go, that's not the world I live in. I mean, we've in the year 1995, we started to see kids being born in a world where they grew up with the internet, and kids who grew up in the year 2000, they practically grew up with computers in their home. And those kids are saying, look, you're coming to me with a concept from the 1980s like Ghostbusters, and I don't know what that is. That's something that somebody my age at 46 years old would know about, but that's not something a teenager or a 20 something would know about or care. Same thing for Transformers. They wouldn't understand was all about, because you had to be there in 1984 for that to resonate with you as important. And the reason why, though, a lot of those concepts resonated with people back then was because a lot of kids back then, we grew up with a lot of latchkey households, and a lot of these characters were like our friends. And for many of these Hollywood executives, they still have that emotional attachment to those characters, which is why they keep relaunching and rebooting those characters instead of moving forward. And this is why Hollywood is struck. One of the reasons why Hollywood is struggling is they want to continue giving us their favorite characters that they were close to, they were attached to like a security blanket. But your Gen Ys, your Gen Zs, your millennials, and they don't connect with these characters because they were not ever growing up in front of a television the way kids of my generation grew up with. Because in my generation, we grew up with tube TVs and we watched these characters regularly. Like I used to watch GI Joe and Transformers on Channel 11 from 3 to 5 o'clock every Monday through Friday. Kids today, they grew up with YouTube, they grew up with social media. So for them, these characters, they don't connect with them. I mean, these characters, they don't really relate to them. I mean, when they see characters like these 80s characters like RoboCop, Terminator, these characters, they're just characters to them, and there's nothing special to them. And when in the entertainment business, you have to answer one critical question, and that question is, why should we care? And how is Hollywood in a creative slump primarily is that Gen Y, Gen Z, millennials, they just don't care about these characters that are being produced by Hollywood, because these are characters that were created for another era, primarily baby boomers and Gen Xers. And because these characters are created for baby boomers and Gen Xers, many of these people don't see these characters as their characters, so they don't resonate with them. Because when I look at Hollywood overall these days, the only time we had a phenomenon was the Harry Potter movies, and the reason why we had that phenomenon is because that resonated with Gen Y, who grew up with Harry Potter. That was their character, and those were the characters they grew up with. So they were like, yeah, I want to go see a Harry Potter movie because Harry Potter was a part of their growing up. Same thing for Captain Underpants and many other characters like the Wimpy Kid. Those were their characters, so they could say, look, these are my characters, and I want to see my characters. Unfortunately, Hollywood has a lot of baby boomer and Gen Xers in charge at the executive level, and they want to continue pushing their versions of characters on on a young audience that's just not interested in those characters. And what exacerbates that who you know mentality in Hollywood, with them trying to push their own favorite characters in that insular environment, is that many of the people who are working in Hollywood as they are making their films, a lot of these people are terrified of failure. And what they don't understand is that, ironically, in their attempts to be safe by making these rebooted movies and these or as they reboot franchises, or they try to launch franchises from old TV shows, what they're doing is, ironically, they're not having much success. And the reason why they're not having much success, again, is because they are just afraid of being creative. They are afraid of taking risks. And ironically, they're doing the exact same things that the people in the 60s were doing. They were doubling down, continuing to try to make musicals, epic movies, and war movies in an era where the audience just wasn't interested in seeing those kind of films because the world of the 70s was a grittier world. It was a darker world of Watergate and Richard Nixon, on high unemployment, inflation, and people struggling. And people were not seeing their struggles on the screens at the box office, and they weren't seeing their struggles on TV in the early 70s. It wasn't until Norman Lear came along that we started to see grittier TV shows, and that was something that, again, allowed the studios to capitalize and reach the audience because they started making, again, grittier things, just like Tom Laughlin and Melvin Van Peebles was doing at the time. And we're not seeing that today. We're seeing, again, movie studios making these reboots, these remakes, and films of old properties because these studio executives are afraid to move forward. And the reason why they're afraid to move forward is that they're afraid of having a box office failure. Unfortunately, the great irony is, again, they're having box office failures because they just don't want to take risks on brand new material from creators like myself and many other comic creators, sci-fi creators, and fantasy creators. They don't want us to come to the helm of making our own projects, so they go with the who you know mentality and then try to go find people who are a part of their Hollywood echo chamber and hire those people to try to tap the cultural pulse. Unfortunately, many of the people who they try to hire to tap the cultural pulse are grossly unqualified, and people like your J.J. Abrams, they are complete hacks. Now, J.J. Abrams has been a complete hack ever since the late 90s and the TV series Felicity. And in season two, he was the guy who helmed the show where Felicity, who was a popular character on WB, cut her hair short and then eventually led to that show tanking in the ratings because that was the jump the shark moment of the show. Now, he also helmed the show Lost, which fell apart after a finale, but Hollywood still goes out of its way to hire this hack known as J.J. Abrams, and they gave him Star Trek, which was again hobbled by being an old property as a reboot, and then they also gave him Star Wars, which was also hobbled as an older property, and he has made a complete mess. The same thing for Zack Snyder, who people considered to be a visionary because he made one film, 300, then they gave him the DC Cinematic Universe, and he made a complete mess of that whole franchise and practically torpedoed that franchise before it even got off the ground with Man of Steel because his vision was completely wrong for the Superman character. So you had two people who were grossly unqualified, and they were trying to put a fresh take on older characters. But the big problem was, one, they did not stay true to the source material of those characters, and two, they went out of their way to willfully and intentionally alienate the older fan base in order to try to reach the newer fan base. And that's a cardinal sin as related to franchise movies because you definitely want to get the older fan base active because the older fan base is going to be what drives the ticket sales overall for the film. This was also an approach that was used by your Warner Brothers with Catwoman, where they had Patoff making a Catwoman film with Halle Berry, and that failed spectacularly in 2004. Comic fans got together and practically killed that film before it hit theaters. And what's happening right now with franchises like Star Wars, Star Trek, and many others is the exact same thing. Many of the fan bases who grew up with these properties, they're saying to themselves, this is not what I grew up with. This is not true to the source material. And because it's not true to the source material, they have no interest in supporting it. So when they hear that you have these directors like your J.J. Abrams, like your Ryan Johnson, and like your um, Zack Snyder going out of their way to make changes to the characters, make changes to the story model, and make changes to the source material, that really makes them pause because a lot of those people, they remember growing up the disaster known as Batman and Robin. And because they remember the disaster known as Batman and Robin and how bad that movie was, that makes them pause when they start hearing about people wanting to change the source material. And with the advent of the internet, you have people on message boards who can practically kill a movie before it starts. And this is what killed Catwoman in 2004. And it also creates the negative buzz that practically kills many of these movies before they can even get out of the gate to open on opening night. So this is one of the things that's really starting to put a hobble on Hollywood, is that they have these message boards and the internet. And a lot of times, again, when they hear about deviations from the source material, people start walking away, start hating the movie. And that buzz really starts to put a damper on the box office. So when you have directors, again, running off their mouth, like your J.J. Abrams, like your Ryan Johnson, and your Zack Snyder, it does not bode well for a film. It's not like the days of 2008 with Iron Man. When we first saw the picture of the Iron Man armor, people were getting excited for the film because they said, yes, this cosmetically different, but it's Iron Man and it's true to Iron Man. And then when they saw the movie was just like David Michelini and Bob Layton comics, this got people excited for the film. Now, people don't mind changes like with Blade. They didn't mind most of the changes because it was just a great film. But when you start having directors running off their mouth and making bad press, this alienates people. And then on top of it, once you have the film come out and it's just a terrible movie, then people have no reason to go see the movie, and it winds up dying before it gets started. So a lot of these problems in Hollywood, they practically compound each other. The who you know mentality, the grossly unqualified directors whose vision is not in tandem with the character, the directors then getting arrogant and saying things about their project that alienate people, the no efforts to galvanize the fan base that's older, and attempts to appeal to a younger fan base that isn't interested in these types of characters. All of these things are leading to the Hollywood creative slump and leading to Hollywood having lots of struggles as related to building audiences for many of its more recent films. A lot of the more recent films, a lot of them are when they're greenlit, there's no real vision for what they want to shoot. A lot of times they don't really take time to think about how they want to adapt the source material. They don't really think about what type of story they want to tell. And they don't think of a way to make the story resonate with large audiences. And they just don't answer that one critical question as related to movies that I learned when I was studying screenwriting. And that is, why should we care? If you can't answer that question, then you're not going to be able to sell a movie, whether it's a budget of $100,000 or a budget of $100 million. And unfortunately, most of your baby boomer and Gen X executives, they just don't understand that if you can't answer the question, why should we care, then the audience has no incentive to buy into the movie. Because you have to make the audience care from the first frame of the trailer. And if you can get them to care, then you can get them excited and you can get them chattering on the message boards and you can get the audience excited for the film. So if you can get the audience excited for the movie, then you're going to be able to have that blockbuster opening on opening weekend. Because the way you open movies is like on blockbusters is one through the word of mouth through a great trailer, or two through producing a just truly great film. I remember back in 1990 when Pretty Woman upended Total Recall, Dick Tracy, and RoboCop 2. People didn't understand why that movie resonated, but that movie resonated because it was a satire of a fairy tale and it was just a plain old fun movie. Same thing with Ghost, which also was the number one movie of 1990. It also resonated with people because it was just a great human story. And both of those movies, again, low budget, but they related to people and they connected with people. And those films, they took overtook things and got word of mouth. Same thing with Sam Raimi's Spider-Man back in 2002. I remember Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. People didn't expect that movie to do well, but after people came out the theater, and I remember being in the concourse multiplex, I was like, "This is a great film," and I knew it was going to do well after I watched it. I was like, "This is going to be a blockbuster," and it become the number one movie of 2002 because it was just like a Spider-Man comic book, and it was just so exciting. I mean, that movie was a classic and people loved that movie because of the word of mouth. And again, you have to build the word of mouth those two ways. But what Hollywood wants to do now is tell you what to like, and you can't tell people what to like. In order to build the word of mouth, you have to make a great product and people will discover it. But what I'm seeing now from many of these newer executives is a lot of insecurity. They want a guarantee of success, but you really can't get a guarantee of success. So, what they want is for there to be this guarantee of success where they want these safe franchises to be successful. And I'm going to get to Edic's question about Gemini Man in a minute because I think Will Smith has a problem. And the problem with Will Smith is he's still playing all of these characters like he was in his 20s. And people aren't relating to that because they look at Will Smith and they see a 50-year-old man. And Gemini Man failed at the box office because you have Will Smith, who was 50 years old, still playing the same character he played when he was 25. With Will Smith, I still see some room for his career to come back, but he has to do what George Clooney did and play older, more sophisticated characters, and he has to play more dignified, refined characters. The problem is he has grown older, but the kind of character he plays has not grown up. If you look at characters like Tom Cruise used to play, he's no longer playing Lestat in Interview with the Vampire and those type of characters. He's trying to play older, more grizzled and refined characters. And the same thing with many other older actors like Brad Pitt, George Clooney. They realize that they're older and they realize they have to play a different type of character. I mean, Cary Grant back in the day, he himself said at 59 he didn't want to play the character in Charade because he said a 59-year-old man should not be playing that part. But he realized he would just do it one last time to move on because he was, and when he played that character in Charade, he was playing an older, more dignified version of the character he used to play. So that's something that Will Smith needs to really focus on because, as I see it, he still has a lot of promise for this career, but it's time for him to regroup and play older characters. And like Mickey Rourke did in The Wrestler when he was playing Randy the Ram Robinson. You didn't, because I remember watching Mickey Rourke in films like Harley Davidson and the Marlboro Man, and he changed to play Randy the Ram Robinson. Completely different character, a little bit older, a little bit more grizzled, a little bit more, harder edged, more textured. And he realized he had to adapt and change up. And Will Smith, he really desperately needs to change up. I'm going to leave a link to the Patreon, and I'm hoping you guys donate to the Patreon. Because that's how I pay for the internet, and that's how I'm able to continue making more videos. So if you guys could donate to the Patreon, I'd really appreciate it. Or if you want to make a one-time donation, you can hit up the Cash app by clicking the links in the chat. And you can also pick up some of my SJS Direct books like John Haynes' Dark Succubus, which is available now in paperback and Kindle formats. Isis All That Glitters, and Esteem Goddess of. All of them are available in paperback and Kindle formats. And I'd really appreciate if you would pick one of those up. And I'm going to get back to the topic because I really like this topic. Talking about Hollywood's creative slump. And again, Will Smith, he needs to change up. And Hollywood desperately needs to change up right now because at this point, you have a new generation of people coming of age, and they're not seeing themselves on screen. And they look at films like Ghostbusters 2016, they look at films like the Terminator Dark Fate, and they look at those films and they say, those are dad's characters, not my characters. Those are dad's stories, not my stories. And when they say that, because they are not seeing their stories on screen, they are not seeing their experiences on screen. And when they don't see their stories and experiences on screen, this is something that is de-incentivizing people from going to the movies. And many millennials, Gen Zs, and Gen Ys, a lot of them aren't going to the movies because they just don't have the money. The job market has changed in the last 20 years from I've seen from my own personal experience. And many of the jobs people used to have in the 80s, people don't have anymore. And many millennials and Gen Ys and Gen Zs, $15 is a lot of money. So going to the theater is not something many younger people do because money is not something that they can get, because a job these days, it barely lasts a year, year and a half, or 2 years. And it's hard to get disposable income together to go do things like go to the movies when many of the jobs don't pay much and they don't last long. So Hollywood doesn't understand that most people out here who are younger, in their 20s, 30s, and even in their late teens, they are struggling in comparison to previous generations where at 18 years old, you got up and got yourself a job and you were able to start your life. A lot of people in Hollywood are still thinking that the world works like when they were growing up, not understanding the world is a completely different place than it was 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So they're not seeing their world and their experiences. And Hollywood wants them to go out and spend $15 on a movie when most people, they grew up with cell phones, they grew up with computers, and most kids today, they don't really like going out that much because they can't afford to do it. So they sit there and say, how am I going to get $15 for a movie ticket when a $15 is a lot of money, and I can't really spend that type of money on movie tickets when there are other things that they could spend it on and afford? Because I've talked to many young people and they say, look, I want to go get Netflix and I can watch as many movies as I want. And a lot of them will get together as a bunch of friends. They'll watch Netflix at home, bring their own snacks, and they wait for the movies to come to streaming services because they just can't afford to go to the theater. I mean, back in the day, yeah, just like Jason was saying, theater was only $5, but again, $5 spent very differently. Today, $15, they it doesn't spend as well, and you have to go work at a job like Target or Starbucks, and again, you don't know if you're going to keep that job, so you have to hold on to whatever dollars you have. So the economy has changed since the 2008 recession, but Hollywood is expecting to make blockbuster dollars like it did in the 1990s. It doesn't understand that people will go get themselves a Netflix account and wait for a lot of these movies to come to Netflix because they can go get one account, get their friends together, watch those movies together, and have a great time. And that's the way they socialize. They don't go to the theater anymore. They do most of their stuff at home, and they would rather spend that money on things like Netflix or game subscriptions or things like apps because a lot of people they live through their phones primarily, and today's kids that's primarily how they get their information. I mean, I've run into people on the street and they've told me they watch my videos primarily on their cell phones, so they are seeing a completely different world. And again, we're not seeing their world on screen. We're not seeing their world on screen. And many of the Hollywood executives, they just don't understand that they are just not producing material that relates to people of this generation. It's not relating to them. And that's why the movies are primarily failing because the kids are saying, hey, that's not one, that's not my character. And two, that's not my experience. It's just like the baby boomer generation back in the 60s. They're saying the exact same thing. This is not what I grew up with. And sadly, Hollywood doesn't want to give people their experiences. What they want to do is try to continue giving us their old franchises and cut and paste a new character on them, like what they did with the Star Wars franchise with these new characters like Rey, Poe Dameron, and your Finn. And unfortunately, it didn't work because, again, people saw right through it and they said, hey, this is not telling my story. This is somebody telling me what my story should be. And this is why Star Wars new trilogy has struggled. But because your Gen X executives and your baby boomer executives are so insecure, what they are doing is they think that they can force people to like their version of Star Wars. Unfortunately, people just don't like their version of Star Wars because they don't see themselves in that version of Star Wars. What they see is an attempt to pander to them. And this is why the films have not resonated in the same way that the original trilogy resonated with people, because the original trilogy, it really made a commentary about people coming together. It made a commentary about all of people, different races and species coming together to take on this machine of an empire and show how humanity can overcome a group of people with technology. And the great irony is that the new Star Wars is all about technology and all about trying to use technology to try to appeal to a generation of kids who grew up with computers, but not showing us the humanity that really resonated in the original Star Wars trilogy. And this is the big problem with many of these films, is that they focus so much on special effects and they overcompensate by using special effects for their weak stories. Because what makes a film resonate with people is the story about the human condition. And it's the stories about the human condition that allow people to connect with the characters, connect with the stories, and see those characters as people just like themselves. And this is a big problem with a lot of Hollywood's films these days. They feel so mechanical. They feel so uninspired. The visuals are just the same films over and over again. I mean, I remember I was sitting there, I was watching TNT. I had watched an Avengers movie, then I watched Amazing Spider-Man, and I said, it didn't matter if whether it was Sony or Disney. Special effects were all the same. The scripts were all the same. Same thing with the Justice League movie. It's just bland, cookie cutter. It does not connect with you. It's just about somebody wanting to put these characters up here and make their version of a movie, and they've left the audience out of the story, and they've even left the story out of the story. It's just about them insert sequence here, insert sequence here, insert CGI here to cover up for the weak story. And there is nothing there that of substance that really resonates with people, because the people part has been taken completely out of the story. And when you take people out of the story, then people just don't care. And again, goes back to that question, why should we care? And it's hard to care about Hollywood because even after they make these films for a cash grab, that's all they really care about is making money. They don't really care about the customer and giving them the kind of film that they want. And when I look at the whole thing about not caring about people, again, this is the main reason why so many of these films just are struggling, and why Hollywood is struggling is they want to continue making films for another generation. And what's really sad about this case is, just like the 60s executives, you have these stubborn executives and stubborn directors and producers who just don't who think their way is the only way. They don't want to listen to the customer, and they insist on doing things, and they insist on doubling down. It's really about their agenda, like Turtle Sage has said, and their egos, because with a lot of the SJW stuff, they continue to double down, pushing it and pushing things like this heroin agenda. And the reason why the heroin agenda is failing is because basically because with the heroin agenda, you're trying to make a product for a customer base that has never been interested in it, because it seems like Hollywood has this obsession with making a heroine have her own lead movie. And sadly, women just don't go to those kind of movies. They are thinking because the population is a majority women, they would want to see an action movie, but women just don't go to see action movies. Usually, women go to see action movies when they're dating a guy, but usually it's primarily guys who made action movies the big hits that they were. Now, what they're thinking is some of the guys would want to see a woman in an action movie, but that's not been the case from what I've seen so far. A lot of guys, they want to see a muscular alpha male like Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sylvester Stallone, Carl Weathers back in the day with Action Jackson, Timok from The Last Dragon. They want to see a masculine man fighting and protecting a woman, and that's part of the escape of a action movie, is seeing this guy who people see themselves as, and they're not seeing that. And even in many of the superhero movies, we're not getting to see the masculinity presented the way it was in the action movies. A lot of the males are softer in the superhero movies, but people like seeing those strong masculine men, and women like seeing those strong masculine men because they want a man who they believe can be a protector. And that's one of the things that they relate to. So the attempts to try to push heroines has really failed because women don't want to see a woman acting in a masculine role. And that's why the Terminator Dark Fate failed. That's why Ghostbusters 2016 failed. And that's why Ocean's 8 failed, because women want to see when they see heroes, they want to see the man being strong and masculine. And when it comes down to women, they want to see a woman being having strength of character, because when you're writing heroines, and this is something I have a lot of experience from because I've written what is it? I think 15 ISIS series books and I think 16 East Team series books, and I've written books like the Spinsterella trilogy. And many of my readers, male and female, they like seeing a woman who is soft and feminine, and they want to see a woman with a strong internal character, and they want the type of girl they want to date or marry on screen. Basically, they want the fantasy of seeing the girl of their dreams. And the girl of their dreams is not somebody like what we saw in the Terminator Dark Fate. They don't want a masculine woman, they want a softer, feminine woman. And this is something they want to see. They want to see women who are soft and feminine, but Hollywood continues to try to give us these harder, so called strong women, not understanding that what makes women attractive to both men and women is a soft, feminine woman with a strength of character. And I know from my own experience presenting those type of heroines, I've had great success with books like All About Nikki, which was an international hit, the Thetas, and the Spinsterella trilogy, that women want their heroines to be having that internal character where they're willing to fight for what they believe in, stand on their moral principles, and stand by the man they love and care about. But they're not seeing that at the movies. And because they're not seeing that at the movies, that's why a lot of women have no incentive to watch these super heroines on many of these movies out here, because they're not seeing the woman they want to be. And a lot of guys are not seeing the guy they want to be, because Hollywood, again, is not presenting us with the fantasy we want to see. And when it comes down to the social justice part of it, they're presenting us with reality. Now, people don't pay money to see problems. They go to the movies to escape their problems and possibly find solutions. But many of these executives today, they want to give you a problem, and even worse, they want to give you more problems that people just don't relate to. I mean, if you want to make a story that relates to millennials and Gen Zs, when I think of stories, I do stories like I did East Team Little Girl Lost, where I talked about a child not having parents that spend time with her, and she sees the Easteen character on YouTube, and when she sees Easteen in real life, it's like a celebrity to her. And that was a story I got just sitting there watching social media and seeing how kids react to people online. So I've seen people do that online from my own personal experience. So um, and I talked about that with the Easteen Little Girl Lost story. And I talked about how the parents were not spending time with her and how that was leading to a disconnect between her and her family, the girl's family, and why the girl was going out on her own to be out on the streets by herself, because she couldn't get them to take her to see the movie. So she went out to see the movie by herself, and how she used things like the internet to go buy her tickets. And then Easteen finds her and helps the parents find the little girl. So I talked about things that related to today, and that story was very popular with a lot of readers, and people share it all the time. And you can get your own copy on Smashwords by clicking the link in the chat. I've left that story for free because I want more people to read that type of story. It really resonated with a lot of younger people, and it's really a lot of the experiences they tell me, it's theirs. So it's a story that people know about, but we're not getting that type of story on screen. And the same thing with Spinsterella, where I was talking about, the job market, and I was talking about the struggles people have in the workplace. And these are things that millennials, Gen Zs are dealing with, but nobody is talking about as related on screen. We don't see people talking about people having to work these jobs where these managers are NPCs. They have unrealistic expectations. they cut your hours, they do stuff that is passive aggressive. The workplace, they don't talk about these type of things, and they don't talk about how you have to literally budget your money. These are things that I grew up and experienced, and I knew that a lot of younger people, when I would listen to their videos and talk to them, they would say the same thing. They would say, look, I'm going through this. I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep this job, or I don't know, um, or how I'm going to be able to make these bills, or how am I going to be able to help my family, because a lot of people are living at home, and a lot of people think, oh, living like a lot of Gen Xers and baby boomers say, oh, that guy doesn't have his own place. What's wrong with him? Not understanding that if you cut people's wages, if you cut people's ability to get jobs and stable jobs, then they can't go out on their own. So they don't have the money. And I've seen this a lot of times. People just don't have the money. So what they do is they try to make it the best way they can. And this is why they are living with their parents, is because they can't get that stable job. And then once they get that stable job and they start building some momentum, they get the rug yanked out from under them. Either they get their hours cut, or they get their job terminated, or their job gets replaced with automation. So millennials, Gen Zs, Gen Ys, they are dealing with a completely different world. And again, they are not seeing their world on screen. And that's really, again, why they have no reason to invest in going to a movie about a world they aren't seeing. I mean, superhero movies, yes, they are a great escape, and many of these older science fiction and fantasy franchises are a great escape, but people want to see people on screen, and they're not seeing people on screen from most of these studio films that are just made to be cash grabs to appeal to older generations, but not really reaching the younger generations. Now, the only aberration to this is the new Joker movie. Now, I thought that movie was going to fail, but to my surprise, it has become a box office phenomenon. And from what I read in the synopsis, the reason why it became a box office phenomenon is because it speaks to a lot of the things that Gen Zs, millennials, and Gen Ys have been dealing with over the last 30 years. And it's a film that resonates with people because a lot of people are frustrated. A lot of people feel like they're not being treated right. A lot of people feel like they're not being respected. And a lot of people feel like they're not being appreciated, especially a lot of men out here. And this film resonated with a lot of those men out here who are frustrated, who are extremely angry, and feel like they're being mistreated, disrespected, and they want to find a way to lash out at society. So the Joker movie was speaking to those audiences, but that was like back in the it was like the film that I believe is one of those turning points for Hollywood, but we're not Hollywood is not really connecting on it the same way it didn't connect in the 1960s as related to the overall box office. They're still trying to use the same old model for films that was successful in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, and they're still trying to make franchises and still trying to make trilogies. But I see the turning point here in 2019 with the complete failure of Terminator Dark Fate and the success of The Joker. With both of those films, I see a major paradigm shift for Hollywood, but I don't know if the executives there have the backbone or the stones to turn the course, because in order to turn the course, what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to find new material, and they're going to have to reach out to new creators out here, and they're going to have to reach people with different stories. But Hollywood executives, again, they are just really scared, and they don't want to take that risk because they don't see, they want to play it safe. But what they don't see is that the whole model for the superhero movie and the franchise movie is falling apart, just like the musicals, war movies, and epic historical movies did in the 60s, because the business model for those movies is falling apart because the budgets for those films gets larger with each passing year. I mean, these films now cost anywhere now from 300 to 500 million dollars, and the minimum budget is 200 million dollars for these superhero movies and these MCU movies. So the proportions to as related to cost and getting to a profit is more difficult to reach, and this is why they have to rely so heavily on the international box office, is because they need the international box office in order to pull a profit. So back in the day when they would do these movies, like the original trilogy, the film was only $10 million, which was a lot of money back in the 70s. But if you're making $100 million, you are going to get your budget back plus a nice profit. And then when you do the international box office, you are going to make even more money, and you're going to make a nice, tidy profit. And with the movies costing very little back then because actor salaries were low and production costs and advertising costs were low, you could pull very nice profits. But these days, it's very difficult to pull profits because these films cost, again, a minimum of $200 million. And then you compound that with your advertising budget, and with films having to make 3 times its money. So this film has to make anywhere from 600 million to 1.2 billion. So they have to rely on the foreign box office instead of just pulling a profit just on the American box office like they used to. And that's why many of these studios are struggling right now, overall, because films like Star Wars, these films cost anywhere from 300 to 500 million dollars. Terminator Dark Fate was $200 million, and again, these films have to make 600 to 1 point something billion in order to pull a profit. Whereas again, back in the 70s, you had a film like Godfather, which made cost $1 million and made a good $70 million. So they made like 700 times profit, and then after that, they made even more. So studios have really painted themselves in the same corner that they painted themselves in as related to production cost and as related to these concepts. These superhero movies, yes, they are big, grand spectacles, but they just aren't pulling profits. It's a law of diminishing returns as related to them. And it's clearly time for Hollywood to usher in a new generation of creative people. And it's time for them to usher in a new generation of creative people with new stories and new concepts that relate to people of today and relate to kids of today. So, Rob, I don't really see Dark Horse. I mean, Dark Horse has some good comics, but Dynamite spends most of his time on older properties. So when it comes down to the comic companies, I don't really see them providing any new stories. A lot of the new comic stories I'm seeing are coming from creators like myself, guys like Mike Williams with Deke Sledge, guys like Josh Howard with T-Bird and Throttle, guys like Chris Brown with Omega Black. A lot of the new stuff is coming from creators, and the creators are owning their property. And a lot of the creators now own their property these days because print on demand technology has made it cheap, one, to publish new material, and two, a lot of people are just tired of waiting for Hollywood to contact them. Because I remember, a couple of years ago, about 10 years ago, I was sending out queries for All About Marilyn, which is a screenplay I wrote back in 2009. and I couldn't even get in the door with this screenplay about a faded former 1990 sitcom star. And it was a story that a lot of people, it resonated with them, but I couldn't get in the door with the studios and stuff with it, and I couldn't get in the door with people, so I just independently published it. And people want these type of stories, but they just can't get those stories because I know a lot of people who love 90s sitcoms like Saved by the Bell, California Dreams, Hang Time, and I wrote a story, but it couldn't really reach those people because these baby boomers and Gen Xers, they wanted to continue making their type of story instead of telling the stories that people knew. Now, I knew a lot of people in the 90s, they sat there and they watched these shows and they wanted to see that type of story because they grew up with that type of story. They usually don't 10 to 30 years of recent movies. And, well, the problem with the reboots is that they just start over. They admit the thing is that they start over and over again, and that makes it frustrating for people. And they're starting to reboot things as related to many of these movie franchises, but people don't like reboots. From what I remember back when they did the reboot at Marvel, um, and 98, people were tolerating it then, but when they saw things fall apart in 2001, they didn't want to bother with it anymore because the problem is, again, the why should we care question. And it's hard to care about something when you know it's going to all get canceled and rebooted because some writer painted himself into a corner and there's no editor to give him guidance. And that's the big problem. Another problem with Hollywood is there's nobody there to sit down and give people guidance as related to storytelling, as related to writing, and putting together stories overall. A lot of times they just want to go out here and make these franchises, not understanding that if you do a franchise, you have to have a set goal for what type of story you want to tell. For example, when I was doing the Spinsterella trilogy, I had a set goal for what type of story I wanted to tell. I wanted to tell the story of Matilda Crowley's growth in the goth subculture, and that was my goal. I wanted to show those three phases that I saw in the goth subculture. I wanted to show the baby bat phase in Spellbound. I wanted to show the adolescent phase in Legendary Mad Matilda, where she was exploring different parts of the scene as she was getting her adult life together. And I wanted to show in Spinsterella her elder goth phase, and I wanted to show how this woman grew up in the scene over the course of 25 years or so. And I wanted to do it in a way that people in the scene could relate to and resonate with them. And I understood that when you're doing a trilogy, you have to make each story its own individual story with its own beginning, middle, and end. And as the story progresses, you see the character grow and evolve. But that's something we're not seeing with these new trilogies, like with Star Wars. We just see them making a trilogy for the sake of making a trilogy. And they want to make three stories so that they can say they made a trilogy. But when you're doing a trilogy, you have to have a goal as related to what you want to do and what theme you want to explore and what ultimate goal you want to accomplish. And the same thing with serialized storytelling. When I write a series like an ISIS series or an E-Steam series or a John Haynes series, what I want to do is have a character transformation arc. And when you have a character transformation arc, you have a point where the character starts, a point where the character grows, and then a point where the character eventually reaches a turning point and changes. And this is something we're not seeing with this attempt to make franchise movies. A lot of times they make the movies and it's just about making a number two because the other one was successful at the box office, or a number three because it was successful. But what I wanted to do was tell a great story where we see this character change and grow over the course of several stories. And in each story, we see them grow and mature. And that's something I saw in the original Star Wars trilogy. And it was something that I saw in many of the other films and TV shows I used to watch in the 80s. Rob, I asked, speaking of trilogies, do you think Back to the Future and Indiana Jones could have been stretched out. No, I think they should have stopped after a certain point. I think that once you tell a character's story, what you want to do is let that character finish and go on its way. For example, again, when I wrote all about Marilyn, I just let it be a one-time story. I mean, she did make an appearance in Isis, All About the Goddess, but I let the story stand on its own. What you want to do is eventually realize that you come to a point where once you finish that character's story, it's time to move on to other characters. And this is something that many in Hollywood, because these franchises make so much money, they want to keep the franchises going. But there comes to a point where the story finishes and you just have to move on to another story. And in Terminator, I believe Terminator ended with Terminator 2. I believe that RoboCop should have ended with the first RoboCop. And there comes a point where the story has to end. I mean, usually, like in comics, when you finish a story arc, once the story arc ends, you start a new one. Like, for example, when I finished E-Steam Ascension and E-Steam got her new powers, I had to start a new story arc with Goddess Up. So with this book, I had to start a new E-Steam story arc. And that's something that every writer has to do, is know when to put a period at the end of things and move on. I mean, if you want to revisit those characters, you can, but oftentimes it's best to just let their stories end and then go out here and create another character. Now, I like with Spinsterella, I love writing Spinsterella stories, but I realized I needed to give the Matilda Crowley character a bit of a rest after Legendary Mad Matilda, and I decided to go and do Eternal Night instead, which was about vampires in the SJS Direct universe. I liked writing goth characters, but I wanted to do something different because I wanted to give that character a rest, and I wanted to give people a quality story featuring those characters. So yeah, Rob, IS, it's primarily the reason why, financially, is the reason why Hollywood continues to make the same movies over and over again. But now they're at a point where they just can't do it anymore. And you have many of these studio execs still trying to push their agenda and push their characters onto people and push these characters in an effort to get cash grabs from places like China. But the problem is that these films cost so much money that they don't make any profit overall. So I look at that and I say to myself, um, it's time to do something different. It's time for some new concepts. It's time for some new stories. And Hollywood, again, is going to have to be dragged kicking and screaming again, like it did in the 60s, because it just doesn't want to listen. Joshua makes a very good point. He predicts that comic book movies will go out of style by the middle of the next decade. I have to agree with him on that. Comic book movies already are starting to wane. People are starting to get tired of them. And I don't think it's a good time for another Matrix sequel. I think The Matrix is finished. That was another film I felt was done with one movie, and that was Hollywood greed again. They wanted to make a bunch of money on The Matrix because the first movie made a bunch of money and it was a phenomenon. So they came out with Reloaded, which had a really poor story, and then they came out with Revelations, which fell completely apart. So the entire, again, attempt at a trilogy failed because they had one story, but then they did not have really a real plan for a character transformation arc, and they really made the whole concept falter. I mean, this is where a writer comes in and just lets people know, look, okay, the story is finished and we need to move on. It's like Pretty Woman back in 1990. Some people wanted a sequel to Pretty Woman, but I felt it should have been a one-off, and I'm glad it was a one-off. Same thing with Ghost. I'm glad that movie was a one-off, because that's what makes that film a classic, is that you just don't keep making these films over and over again. I mean, yes, we love this character, but sometimes it's just best to let that character be that character, let them be a part of that classic story, and then it's just time to move on. It's something that a lot of people have a hard time doing in Hollywood these days because a lot of Gen Xers have emotional attachments to many of these characters. And as they have come into these executive positions, they want to see their friends on screen over and over again. But the younger audiences don't want to see their friends on screen, and they don't care about these people on screen. So they look at it and go, this isn't something I want to see. And this is why the movies are failing. And they're failing because people want their stories. If you guys want to donate to the super chat, I would really appreciate it. And if you want to donate to the Cash App, I would really appreciate it. Thank you, Rob IS. And if you want to donate to the Patreon and help me continue to make videos, I would really appreciate it. And if you want to buy the books from the SJS Direct Imprint, like John Haynes' Dark Succubus, Isis All That Glitters, The Esteemed Goddess of, All About Marilyn, or The Temptation of John Haynes, I'd really appreciate it. I mean, I have a lot of great titles on Amazon right now. Luciano, I don't know about celebrity gossip. That hasn't really ruined the meaning and foundation of movies as I see it. The problem with Hollywood right now is that it's an insular environment, and it's not really celebrity gossip that's doing the damage to Hollywood. It's primarily they're out of touch with everybody in America. They're not really resonating with everyone in America. They're not telling the stories of people in America, with the exception of Joker. And they're not talking to people in America. And this is why many of the movies are failing. And this is why many of the movies aren't really the hits that they anticipated them to be. Because people don't see themselves on screen, and they don't see their stories on screen. So that's a big problem with today's Hollywood. And the stories people are getting, they're going outside to independent writers like on Indiegogos with the comics over there. They're going to print on demand books to get the stories that they want. And they go to those stories because they say, hey, this is my experience. This writer is speaking to me. But Hollywood doesn't want to go talk to people like myself who present stories about their experiences because they know they have to pay us. And this is the thing. They don't want to pay guys like myself these days because they know that it's going to be a lot of money. Moreover, in some cases with black creators like myself, they just don't want to see a black man with that type of money or get that type of money because they know that we may do things like group economics and we may try to empower other black people, or we may try to build with other black people, and they don't want to see their dollars being used for those endeavors. So they don't want to give money to independent creators because their agendas don't fit their narrative. It may be something like black empowerment. It may be something like a Christian thing. It may be something as related to a different culture. And they don't want to see that group of people get empowered through promoting, buying their film rights or TV rights or spending money with them. So they want to keep those people out of Hollywood's business, and they want to go out here and only want to push their people. Again, they want to have the echo chamber, and they want to have their people make the money. They want to keep the money in their circles. So they primarily just want their people and their stories. Unfortunately, in an echo chambers do not provide economic empowerment. In order to get economic empowerment, you have to reach audiences outside of your small environment. And this is, again, something that's hurting Hollywood because they don't want to reach out to new creators and allow them an opportunity to present their stories or present fresh takes on genres like horror, genres like fantasy, genres like science fiction, and they don't want to bring in people like African American science fiction and fantasy creators or manga creators or other or horror creators. They want to continue telling their own stories over and over again. Unfortunately, again, the younger audiences look at those stories and they just don't connect with those stories because to them, that's not their life being presented on screen. That is not their experience being presented on screen. And because they're not seeing their life and their experience, they really don't care about anything being presented at the theater. I mean, I myself, looking at many of these films out here, I don't see anything that makes me care. So I look at it again and I ask again, it's the critical question that Hollywood just can't answer as related to the projects they greenlight. They can never answer the question for the audience. Why should we care? And if you can't, again, make this audience care about your film, you are not going to make money. Now, whenever I do a project, I ask those three questions that I learned from screenwriting. Who is the main character? What do they want? And why should we care? Because if you can answer those three questions, then you will be able to create a saleable book, a saleable screenplay, a saleable comic. Because if you can get people to care about your characters within the first, I say, 3 to 5 pages of your story, then you're going to be able to sell your story. And this is something that people in Hollywood don't understand because they think, oh, I've got this franchise that says Star Wars. I've got this franchise that says Terminator. I've got this franchise that says Batman, DC Cinematic Universe, Marvel Cinematic Universe. But if you don't have a story that makes the audience care, you are not going to make any money. Now, as I see it with Hollywood's creative slump, again, I am really tired of seeing superhero movies, and I'm a comic fan, and I'm tired of seeing superhero movies. And I'm also, tired of these films that are just chock full of CGI. And what I want to see really are some human stories and some stories about people similar to what we got in films like The Godfather and Marty and Sunset Boulevard and Rocky. I want to see some human stories and some characters with some humanity. I mean, one of the things when I was writing the novel The Temptation of John Haynes was, yes, it's a fantasy story about Eastine, a she-demon, but it was primarily about Eastine rediscovering her humanity through the example of Christ that John Haynes represented to her. And I want to see human stories about people who have humanity, because that's what I was writing when I wrote All About Marilyn. Was I was writing a story about this faded former teen sitcom star, Marilyn Marie, who was like in a twilight zone for the first 30 pages of the screenplay, where she was in a world where people were angry at this character she used to play, Nikki Desmond, and it was like people were taking their frustrations out on the character, not thinking about how it affected Marilyn Marie. So I want to see some more human stories and human dramas. And that's some of the things I want to see in film. I don't know if Gen Y, Gen Z, and millennials want to see that type of film, because I'm tired of the superhero movies. I'm tired of the slave movies. I'm tired of these other types of movies. I just want to see some humanity in these films. I want to see people being human, people having character transformation arcs, and people we can connect with as human beings. That's something I want to see in many movies. And I also would just love to see somebody make a decent comedy. I mean, people out here, they're having a hard time out here. A lot of people, they come home from these jobs where they have an NPC boss who's basically like a robot. They have this job that's really frustrating them. And basically, what I see these days is people desperately need a laugh. I mean, people, they want to get that laugh, so that they can, take that break and get away from their problems. Now, I oftentimes put a lot of humor in ISIS and E-Steam series books, especially in E-Steam series books, so that you can get a laugh here and there. And sometimes I'll put like like I've done comedy, see if I can get it to come up. The All About Nikki. I was the whole sitcom I wrote. I wrote 13 episodes of a sitcom that was a mix of The Fresh Prince and Clueless, and that's on Amazon right now. You can pick up a copy of All About Nikki. And I write comedy because I want people to laugh. I mean, I look at the state of our media these days, and everything is just so tense these days. There's just so much tension, and people, as I see it, they really need a good laugh. I mean, you need something with some jokes in it. I mean, Saturday Night Live is terrible because they spend most of their time bashing Trump, and these Tonight Show and all these other shows, they spend most of their time roasting Trump. But we want to laugh. We want to joke. I mean, give me something that's funny, and that's something people at Hollywood are not giving us. And I mean, Todd Phillips talked about it when he was making Joker. He said he wanted to make comedy, but because there's so many SJWs in Hollywood, he can't make comedy because people these days are just so thin-skinned and getting offended at every turn. And that's not really something people want to see. People want comedy. People want to laugh. I mean, people are having, a hard time out here, looking for work or trying to make ends meet. And they come to the movies to escape. And I was glad to see Dolomite Is My Name. I was glad to see that because, again, that was another reprieve from all of these tense times out here. And Dave Chappelle was a nice break. And we need, again, more comedy as I see it, because people really needed a break. And when I was writing All About Nikki, because a lot of people, like one of the shows I did a while back, a guy, he noticed my comedy, and I'm a comedy guy, and I always, again, try to slip it in many of my projects. But people want comedy, they want to laugh, they want to joke, they want fun. But Hollywood doesn't want to give us fun. What it wants to give us is social justice, identity politics. People these days, they are very tense, they are very stressed out, and they need a release, as I see it. And again, Hollywood is in a creative slump because it doesn't want to give people that escape. It doesn't want to give us that release. They just want to continue giving us problems. But one of the solutions I see to the problems is you have to give people that escape from their problems, and you have to give them that laugh. And that was another thing that was messed up with the new Star Wars, was there isn't much levity in it. I mean, I remember the original Star Wars had levity moments, which broke up the fantasy, but the new one is just so serious that it's boring. Because sci-fi and fantasy, one of the components of it is humor, and if you're doing sci-fi and fantasy, you have to give people a laugh. You have to give them a joke. It breaks up the tension of the fantasy world, and it breaks up the seriousness of the fantasy world. Because if you watch old Star Treks, they often had Spock and Kirk having humor moments, and Bones McCoy, or they'd have Picard and Worf having them, or Data. And it's those little moments that really give you a break from all of the seriousness of the world. And we're not getting that from a lot of today's media. It's all about social justice, identity politics, and preaching at people. And you don't preach at people when you're trying to entertain them. You try to give them something that they need. And what people need or want is, they want to laugh, they want to get away from their problems for 2 hours, and they want a break from their problems. I'm going to leave a link to Spellbound so you can try the first part of the Spinsterella trilogy in the chat, so you can try that book. And because now they're letting me put in links to Amazon, thank God now. And you can pick up The Temptation of John Haynes. So that's why another reason why Hollywood is in a slump right now is that they're not giving the customers, that release, that break, that tension release. And that's something that people want, but they're just not getting. And it's all leading to the creative slump that they're having right now. And there are people out there, again, like myself, who have great concepts, great stories that resonate with kids of today, adults of today, and even older adults that are in my age range. But again, Hollywood does not want to reach out to those individuals because it means changing their course, it means adapting, and it seems like, again, like their grandfathers and fathers before them, they have to be dragged kicking and screaming if they have to adapt and change to the new audience and the new marketplace. And this is the big problem with Hollywood is there's all this great new material. And again, I've seen it on the Kickstarter level. I've seen it on the Indiegogo level. I've pledged to quite a bit of it. And I've even bought some of it on platforms like Kindle, and I've seen it on different comic book websites. It's out there, a chance to tap into a new audience. But sadly, we just don't have people in Hollywood who have the courage to go out here and reach out to those new writers and bring those fresh and brand new concepts to the audience. I'm going to get ready to wrap up tonight's stream. I want to thank everybody for coming out to the stream. And I would really appreciate it if you guys would check out some of my material, like Esteem Goddess of, Isis All That Glitters, John Haynes, Dark Succubus. All three of these books are available on Kindle and Kindle Unlimited. And if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read these for free. And if you want to check out my screenwriting, you can pick up All About Marilyn, which is now available on Amazon.com. And if you want to see the start of the SJS Direct Universe, you can pick up The Temptation of John Haynes on Amazon.com. And if you want to help me, again, make more videos, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the chat, or you can donate a one-time donation to the Cash App, and that helps me a lot. Again, I want to thank everybody for coming out to the stream, and I'm hoping you'll be there for the next stream next week.